So, here we are at 4 years. 4 years is how long Putin's special military full-scale invasion of Ukraine has now lasted. Longer than the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany, and far longer than anyone, let alone Putin himself, could have expected. And at the cost of an incomprehensible nearly 2 million soldiers either dead, wounded, or missing on both sides. And all for what? 20% of Ukrainian territory, much of it not much really changed since 2014. And territorial advances so slow that NATO's Secretary General once compared them to the pace of a snail. No, seriously, if a snail had left eastern Ukraine's border with Russia at the same time, it would now be somewhere in the midst of Poland. So in this video, I wanted to take a step back and look at the big picture on this anniversary, especially in 3 key areas. What the battlefield reality looks like 4 years in. Why the idea of an inevitable Russian victory is a myth, and how that myth shapes Western policy still. And what this war has revealed about the future of warfare, from drone kill zones to shattered naval doctrines, and of course, how it all might end.
This is the Global Gambit.
How you going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we look at the strategy behind geopolitics, economics, and international relations without the shouting and without slogans. Now, before I get into what has happened, what is happening, and what could happen, a question for you. If Russia is advancing at roughly 70 meters a day and losing around 1,000 plus troops daily, does that qualify as strategic momentum? Or is it simply the slow motion depletion dressed up as strength and implosion of an entire state? Let me know in the comments. When Russia launched its invasion on the 24th of February 2022, the expectation in Moscow was quite simple. Blitz Kyiv, topple the government, install a compliant regime, make it like a Belarus, and end it all quickly. That failed. Instead, what followed was a transformation into one of the bloodiest wars not just Europe but the world has seen since the Second World War, with globally redefining consequences. According to many independent estimates, Russian casualties may have reached 1.2 million, including over 300,000 completely killed. Ukrainian casualties are difficult, but are estimated to be 600,000, with as many as potentially 140,000. For any modern war, be them European or not, that is staggering. It is insurmountable to imagine the impact it has on the lives of those who have lost loved ones, but especially those on the receiving end of an aggressive state. And so what has it produced? Well, over the past 2 years, Russian forces have advanced roughly 50 kilometers into parts of Donetsk. In some sectors, they've moved at an average whopping 70 meters a day. Entire battalions destroyed for the length of a football pitch. You see, the front line stretches roughly 1,200 kilometers. Unlike the early phases of manoeuvre warfare, as it's known, this is now positional struggle, defined by trenches, minefields, artillery, and small infantry groups or raids of 2 to 3 literally soldiers attempting to infiltrate ruined towns flattened by glide bombs. Now, you may ask, why so static? Well, there is a few reasons, but the most of all, drones. Because you see, the war in Ukraine became defined by drone warfare. Cheap drones make mass armour formations impossible, as they are so easy to be detected and therefore destroyed. Ukraine initially used drones to offset Russian firepower advantage, creating what became known as drone kill zones. Russia did adapt, expanding drone production massively and introducing what's known as fiber optic tethered drones, immune to any jam. These wider kill zones, in some areas stretching up to 50 kilometers from the front, structurally locks both armies into this positional, static warfare rather than any ability to break through. Then supply chains become targeted and evacuation routes are focused on. Even movement at night is detected. And so it becomes equivalent to World War I, fused with 21st century surveillance and technology. But despite all this, Moscow has continued to insist on its maximalist demands in the diplomatic negotiations. Putin demanding that Ukraine withdraw from all the region Russia has either illegally annexed or just simply sits in, even if it doesn't have outright control, and has, of course, branded nuclear rhetoric to deter Western escalation, but to such an extent that it's almost becoming like an anniversary of its own, although with a changing date. Within all of this, battlefield progress does not reflect the rhetoric. It only reflects the exhaustion. And that exhaustion is not just visible on the front line. It is visible deeper inside Russia than ever before and in any other time in history. Wars of attrition do not only consume soldiers, they consume entire societies. Over the years, I have spoken to individuals within the country, be them personal friends of mine, family, or simply contacts that I've developed. What they describe is, though not a collapse, but ever-growing strain. Not rebellion, but quiet erosion. And yet, as we know, public criticism remains muted, partly because of the repression, because of the very propaganda machine Putin has created over the 25 years he's been in power, but also because of habit, and because many Russians still frame the war through the language of endurance, historical struggle. Though there is confusion. Before February 22, there were no such things, no such attacks on Russian territory, let alone in Moscow. No car bombs or the assassinations of high-profile generals, and the sense of Kursk and other border regions feeling at risk, as we cover extensively on the channel. Russia's economy, and in this case its budget deficit, is widening, adding further strain to the overall economic outlook. Even those who support the operation do feel the squeeze. And while people like to believe that it is all within the great patriotism of Russia, if they see their pensions go up, if they see their gas prices, if they see their day-to-day lives increasingly affected, that war fatigue sets in regardless of your level of patriotism. And that domestic endurance is precisely what the Kremlin bets on, but perhaps bets on just too much. The leadership calculating that society can absorb the losses, that economic strain can be managed, that elites remain dependent on the regime, and that the time favors the side willing to suffer the longest. It is the test of political stamina as much as the military, inside Russia, inside Ukraine, and of course, inside the West. All that makes me think of the infamous quote by Clausewitz, the famous military historian and strategist, but that war is policy/politics by other means. And this is because this is where the war becomes more than just military. It becomes strategic psychology, and increasingly a trap for Putin's own making. You would think that after 4 bloody years, after staggering casualties, persistent sanctions, drone saturation, economic strain, a war that neither side can decisively win would begin to burn itself out. But it hasn't. And the reason largely lies with this one man. Putin is caught increasingly in a vice of his own construction. I made a video last week about the cannibalization of Russia's economy, and this is the same thing. On the battlefield, the chances of producing something that can be credibly called a victory are waning. In Donetsk, the main axis of effort, Russian forces have advanced 60 kilometers over the course of this campaign. That is the distance from Washington, D.C., where I live, to Baltimore, something you can take in 40 minutes on the train, if you're willing to pay $250. Russia has been unable to generate sufficient combat power to break through Ukrainian lines. Inside the 10 to 30 kilometer drone kill zone, soldiers and equipment cannot mass without becoming targets immediately. Even when Russian units achieve local breaches, they struggle to exploit them. Tactical gains do not convert into operational breakthroughs. And so on its current trajectory, that does not change. For the first 3 years of this war, Russia was expanding its armed forces. But by the end of 2025, it was losing more men than it could recruit. Recruits now are also often poorly trained, morale is non-existent, and desertion rates have increased massively. Russia relies less on patriotic fervor and more on these financial inducements. According to some analysis, the average sign-on bonus has risen to roughly 2.4 million rubles. That's $30,000 per soldier. But that money has to come from somewhere. And therefore, the annual bill for recruitment incentives and military expansion now runs into the trillions of rubles, equivalent to the overwhelming majority of the entire federal deficit of the US. Defense spending now consumes roughly 8% of GDP. Debt servicing costs are rising. Oil revenue projections are completely out of the blue. The rest of the economy is stagnating. This triple header, as I call it, does not mean the imminent collapse, but it does not mean that Putin has the capacity to keep going, to continue to strike Ukraine and encourage the sign-up rate of more recruits who are being flung into the meat grinder. Putin retains the capacity to strike cities, energy infrastructure, to inflict that pain, but aerial bombardment alone is not likely to force capitulation, and his long-standing bet has been that Ukraine, facing manpower shortages, will collapse politically or militarily before Russia does. That's the idea of strategic patience. But this is 4 years in, and he cannot easily pivot to peace either now. Many observers have assumed that negotiations, be them in Geneva or anywhere else, would offer Putin some kind of exit ramp. Some have also believed that external pressure on Kyiv would deliver these territorial concessions sufficient for Putin to declare success. But those pathways are never taken, and even if they would want to be, they are narrowing. Day by day, Ukraine becomes far less dependent on American intelligence and financing than it was at the start of the war. European military support has increased last year to such levels it completely replaced any and all provisions of American. Any durable settlement involving nebulous security guarantees would likely require legislative ratification in Washington. So it doesn't mean it's over. But fundamentally, peace itself carries risks for Putin more than Ukraine. Russia has retooled so much of its economy around defense production and war footing that transitioning away to some kind of peacetime would be not just economically disruptive, but implosive. Hundreds of thousands of men would return from the front without work, but also perhaps even the ability to work. Finding employment for people in a stagnating civilian economy would be difficult. History offers countless uncomfortable precedents. Disgruntled veterans having come back after 1917 or after the Soviet Union's failed efforts in Afghanistan in the 80s. Polls suggest many Russians would initially welcome an end to the fighting, but of course quickly questions would follow about the scale of the losses, the economic costs, about the over-reliance on China's financial and technological support, and about why a campaign itself, presented as swift and absolutely imperative, became as bloody and ambiguous as it has. That scrutiny could constrain Putin's ability to restart this war in the future, and it could produce politically critical to him, which leaves him therefore in a paradox. He cannot deliver the decisive victory he promised at the cost the system can sustainably bear. He cannot easily settle without risking internal stability, but he cannot escalate without further hollowing out of what remains of the state. And this is why the narrative of inevitable Russian victory is so important. If the war cannot be won cleanly, it must be reframed as inexorable. If progress is slow, it must be presented as steady. And if costs are high, they must be portrayed as necessary sacrifice in a civilization-level struggle, something that we have seen Putin reference many a time. For Putin, the purpose is not just to influence Western leaders and policymaking. It is to manage domestic expectations, buy time. It is at the heart of any autocrat's survival. Because ultimately, Putin's readiness to continue depends on the level of pain he believes Russian society can absorb and the level of uncertainty he can impose on his opponents. If external pressure tightens through sanctions on oil exports, restrictions on the shadow fleet, coordinated financial enforcements, these economic vices tighten. And if Western leaders resist the narrative of inevitability and refuse to back what looks like a losing trajectory, the diplomatic environment doesn't just shift, it completely twists upside down. But forcing dictators is notoriously difficult. The longer the war continues, the more damage accumulates, and the clearer it may become to Russians themselves that endurance is very much not the same as success. Now, everyone, including onlookers like myself, who unfortunately expected this war to unfold, did not expect it to last as long as it did. The consensus was that Ukraine was facing a rapid defeat. The numbers of the second most powerful military force favoring Russia. Instead, Ukraine held Kyiv. It sank warships, destroyed strategic bombers thousands of miles from the front. A country with no conventional navy, forcing Russia's entire Black Sea fleet to retreat from Crimea. It used decentralized 3D printing to produce millions of drone components, nearly 3 million drones just last year. Now, Russian fiber optic drone networks leave eastern landscapes draped like spider's web. North Korean troops have fought on behalf of Russia in Russian territory, in a zone that saw the biggest aerial campaign in the Second World War. But Ukraine has expanded its own efforts and capacities too. The war has transformed naval doctrine, air power assumptions, armored warfare concepts, and global supply chains. And it has reminded us of something uncomfortable, that war almost often, if not always, defies any form of prediction. In 1914, leaders believed that they would be home by Christmas. In Vietnam, planners believed metrics would deliver victory. In Iraq, regime collapse was assumed to mean stability. And in Ukraine, initial forecasts of collapse, well, how wrong were they? Now, it is important to acknowledge the mistakes, the strategic miscalculations, but they should also worry us, because the world today faces an unprecedented level of geopolitical uncertainty. Tensions over the military build-up between the US and Iran, in the Taiwan Strait, on the Korean Peninsula, and across more broadly Africa. If we miscalculate Ukraine so profoundly, what can we miss elsewhere? Ukraine has exposed the danger of strategic arrogance. It has also demonstrated that a smaller power can, if in the right conditions, adapt much faster than a larger one. That technology can neutralize mass, and that narrative can shape diplomacy. Ultimately, that wars assumed to be quick can actually grind on into history-defining conflicts. The core question, of course, is what this following year brings. If the current trajectory holds, which most people agree it probably will, 26 is unlikely to be about dramatic territorial shifts. Instead, it will likely be about intensified long-range strikes inside Russia, deeper economic pressure on both sides, and an ever greater reliance on the drones, on the automation, and industrial endurance. Naturally, the decisive variable may not be about the breakthrough on the map, but whether Russia can continue financing an 8% of GDP war effort without hollowing out any more of what remains of its civilian economy, but also whether Ukraine can sustain its own manpower and the unity of specifically Europe now. Ukraine continues to defy the odds, demonstrating the real truth behind the story of David versus Goliath. But so does Russia and its willingness to adapt, innovate, and endure. In other words, the coming year is less about sudden victory and more about cumulative strain. The side that manages its resources, its alliance and domestic politics most effectively will shape the outcome long before any formal peace deal is signed. 4 years in, this war is not over. But Russia has not collapsed. But Ukraine hasn't fallen. The battlefield is basically frozen. But the political contest and the diplomatic flurries between it are not. The decisive variable will not be about the territory. It will be about time. And so the question now is not about who's bigger. It's about whose strategy, particularly their grand strategy, is better. Because this war has already punished hubris, certainty, arrogance, short-sightedness. And the next phase will punish them again. And so I leave you asking you, of course, if you enjoyed the video, to like and subscribe, to consider, what about Europe? Do they have the capacity this year to develop a unified, coherent, longer-term strategy, not just over Ukraine, but over the entire geopolitical globe and situation as we see it? With that in mind, click on this video next to hear one man's take.